I'd like to give you an overview of the basics that underlie this course and look at cybersecurity from the organizational perspective, which is what we do in this class. We begin with the framework for critical infrastructure cybersecurity, version 1.0, that was developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies in the United States in 2014. It has become a reliable tool that practitioners in my network find very valuable in talking with management at all levels. It provides a common language and a common understanding. The notional information and decision flows within an organization are depicted here and show the executive level working with the management level going all the way down to the operational level. In the old days, we didn't have that intermediate management structure. We had technical people trying to talk directly to decision makers to no avail. They talk totally different languages. At the operational level, they're interested in bits and bytes. At the organizational level, they're interested in broad concepts and in risk to the organization and costs. The framework is very simple, which is why I think it's so effective. It basically looks at cybersecurity in an organization, what you do, what are the operations. It looks at it in 5 parts. You need to identify the problem areas, the assets, the information assets you want to protect. You need to protect them. You need to detect if they've been violated or intruded upon. Then you need to be able to respond to that intrusion. And finally, you need to be able to recover the system. Detailed activities in each of those 5 functional areas are described in this graphic. But this is basically how you manage cybersecurity operationally in an organization. Our curriculum looks at the same information. We display it a little bit differently. We make certain that the triad of governance, risk management, and compliance are driving our cybersecurity program. And then we look at the elements for establishing and planning cybersecurity in the following way. We insist that our practitioners understand the goals and mission of the organization that they're defending information for. And then that, along with understanding your governance and compliance and risk constraints, will lead to policy that will protect the right information assets in the organization. And then those policies get implemented in controls that are either procedural or technical. And finally, all of that needs to be disseminated across the organization through information security awareness training programs. Now, this is a static view, but we make it a recursive activity by scheduling regular audits that revisit risks to the organization that will cause an organization to rethink their priorities with their expenditures in cybersecurity. Please note that on the left side, we're looking at things that would fall under the purview of business management. On the right side of the graphic, we're looking at things that are more technical. At a university, business subjects are taught in silos. Technology subjects are taught in places like computer science, electrical engineering. But for our purposes, they come together at the policy level, at the executive level, where you need to have an understanding of both in order to effectively manage cybersecurity in an organization. I emphasize this because a lot of people new to the field or new to the study have the impression that cybersecurity is all about technology, and it's not. We really need to understand how it is operationalized because the human being is involved, and the human being doesn't succumb to technology. And that means that we have to be worried about policy and procedure. So our program covers both the rules and tools, the rules being the policies and procedures, and the tools being the technologies that are required to effectively manage cybersecurity, in particular in the private sector. And I say that because the private sector is constrained by the bottom line, and they're more concerned about expenditures, ROI, other additional constraints that may a forced prioritization of cybersecurity controls that are implemented. So from this point on, we'll be looking at both. I'd like to share with you some basic models that will guide your thinking about security controls. We've talked about some high-level conceptual models for thinking about cybersecurity in general, but now I want to focus on some basic models that will help you thinking about designing security for a system that you may be managing. These two models are elementary and essential for your thinking. Many people who begin their journey in cybersecurity think that cybersecurity is all about maintaining confidentiality or secrets, but it's not. It's also about maintaining data integrity as well as availability. So you certainly, in a hospital system, wouldn't want to have data about you subject to corruption, especially if you have an emergent problem that needs to be taken care of. And at the same time, you would like to have the system available if it's needed for an emergency purpose. We had a situation here in the Northwest where a hospital was being used for a spamming business that was taking over more and more space on the server that likewise was housing personal identifiable information about patients. And so gradually, the spamming operation, which was illegal, it had been established by some attackers that thought they could get in and use that free space, began to crowd out and slow down the systems that were needed for emergent care. And so availability became very important under those circumstances. We call this the CIA of security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This second model looks at how we go about thinking through cybersecurity controls for systems. There's an assessment process that requires assessing the systems that you're attempting to protect for their vulnerabilities, and at the same time mapping threats that may be arrayed against those systems against those vulnerabilities. What threat adversaries are out there that may be looking at penetrating the particular system you're trying to protect? And where do those vulnerabilities in that system overlap with a potential threat? And from those vulnerability and threat pairs, we derive controls, and we develop a map of implementing controls for the entire system. But the success of our controls really depends on how much we trust those controls. There are some assumptions here that the designs we put in place meet the goals of our security needs for the system. We also are assuming that the sum total of all the controls we put in place achieve the goals that we're outlining for our security systems. At the same time, we assume that the implementation is correct, which is more of a function of the human beings doing the installation. And then how are those systems maintained, updated, and patched, and cared for beyond the initial implementation? Those latter 2 points really assume perfect human beings. That being the case, the bottom line assumption you should make in designing any security system is that you'll never be 100% perfectly secure. And I say that over and over again. This is not an end state that you should expect to achieve. So what do you do in those circumstances? Well, the grim reality is that if you have something that's desirable for an adversary, an information object, the probability of it being compromised or taken is 1. It's just simply a function of the adversary's resources and time and the value of that object to the adversary. So in those circumstances, what do we do? Well, in designing security for a system, you need to assume that that system will be breached. And that brings in a different set of factors in your thinking than from the old days when we relied on keeping the adversaries out with firewalls or identifying the adversary quickly with intrusion detection systems. These devices are no longer 100% reliable. It doesn't mean that we don't employ them, but it does mean we develop different strategies that make our systems resilient in the face of breach. So we essentially are also faced with the fact that these controls are going to cost a significant amount of money, and organizations don't have an endless amount of capital to invest in their cybersecurity controls. So how do we prioritize the controls that we come up with? We need to do a basic risk assessment, understanding the likelihood of a breach at a particular vulnerability that we've identified against the cost of protecting it. And I'll give you an example. If you have a database of employee information that keeps track of training records, and we're talking about asbestos training required by the EPA of the employees of this particular company, it may not be an information asset with a high priority to protect. However, if you're a nuclear power plant and you're tracking the training of highly trained nuclear scientists, then you might indeed want to keep that training database as a high priority for protection. You wouldn't want names and identification to get out to particular adversaries. So same idea, training database, different purposes, and so you can see that doing a risk assessment helps you think through the value of the assets that you're protecting against the cost of loss and the likelihood of loss. Again, these models will help you think through how to implement and operationalize cybersecurity in an organization.